Good morning, second hour. So let's talk about what we're doing today. So today we get to do another poetry analysis. Yesterday we learned about individualism and Walt Whitman. Today we're going to review how do you do an analysis, and then together we're going to read and analyze I Hear America Singing. One of the reasons why I chose it is because it shows very clearly how Walt Whitman's style is different from other poets. And I chose it because it's shorter. So I figured it would be a good one to do together. If you have extra time at the end, which you may, since we're doing this together, tomorrow's poem is Song of Myself, and you're going to be doing more of that on your own. So if you want to get a start on that today, that is absolutely fine, or you can wait until we talk about it tomorrow. All right, so at this point, I'm going to flip to Schoology to review the poetry analysis slides a little bit with you, and then we'll get started on this poem. All right, so here is, let's pull it up a little bit. Here's your poetry analysis slides, and you have these in your Schoology. In fact, that's where I'm at. I'm on Schoology. So this is exactly what you have. So when we're analyzing poems this week, if at any point you're like, oh God, I don't remember what syntax is, or I don't remember how to do this, all the steps are right in here. So for example, one of the things we're going to be looking at today is lines. So here's a reminder of how to quote those. Up to you if you have the comma or not between the author and line. I've seen it done both ways. Okay, and then here we have not only review, but the answers. So you can easily flip through this for a little bit of review. So for example, how many stanzas are in this Bradstreet poem? One. A stanza is like a poem paragraph. And then the lines, you just count them. For this poem, the line counting is a little bit trickier, and I'll show you how. Okay, we're also going to be looking at poetic form. What type of poem is this? Now, I would be reviewing rhyme scheme marking with you, but you don't have to do that for this poem, and I'll teach you why. We're also going to be looking for the literal meaning of the poem. So what is the poem about? Also looking for imagery. So what lines in the poem create a clear picture in your mind? Literary devices is one of the things you need to find in the poem. Yesterday, we learned about a new literary device called cataloging that Whitman uses. So we're absolutely going to show you that today. And then figurative language. So what comparisons are made with language in the poem? There's at least one, and I'll go over that with you. And then the final step of analyzing a poem is theme and response. In some of your past work, some of you are missing the response part. Like you'll tell me what the message is of the poem and you'll prove it well. So you'll find the theme and prove it with evidence from the poem. But don't forget to also tell me, if it's asked, what is your response to the poem? I believe this week I took that off just so you would be able to focus on the main parts of the poem. All right, so let's find for you on Schoology here the poem itself. Then we'll start analyzing it. So if you haven't had a chance yet to open up week 9, now would be a great time to do so. So I'm going to open up the poem. I'm going to read it with you, and then we'll analyze it. Sometimes Schoology takes a moment, as I'm sure you know. All right, so here's the poem we're going to analyze today. I Hear America Singing. So I'm going to read it with you, but first, I want to point out to you something that I mentioned earlier. So the lines of this poem are a little bit trickier to figure out because as you can see, for some of these lines, like line 2, it continues on to the next line. So it's kind of hard to tell, is that one line or is that 2? So if it's spaced like that, if it has this little space beforehand, that means it's still part of that line. And just like with other poems, the textbook has done a nice job for us of helping to mark the lines. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then up to 10. So this poem has 11 lines in it. All right, so I hear America singing. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be blithe and strong. Blithe is kind of like blissed out, happy with what you're doing. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song. The plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belongs to the day. At night the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. So some of this you may have picked up is not literal singing. What Whitman is describing is the sound of people happily engaged in work. So one of the things I told you yesterday about Whitman is he's one of the first poets who wrote about, everyday things, normal people, instead of, high themes of nature and all beautiful things. So here he's talking about what it's like to see people around America doing their jobs, and happily so. This is, you can probably tell from reading the tone, since it's singing, it means the sound is them happily productive. So let's look at your handout and start to get some of these answers. And I'm going to flip back and forth so that I can best help you. And hopefully Google Meet will let me do that. All right. So literal meaning, what is the poem about? So what does the author say? So for that, I can write, this is about people working happily. Okay, so you just need for literal meaning one little phrase that shows overall what's happening in the poem. And I'm going to pause so you can write that. Good time for me to have some coffee anyhow. Okay, next in the poem, we get to work on poetic form. So what kind of poem is this? Since we know it doesn't have a set rhyme scheme, the kind of poem it is free verse. So you can just write free verse, and you don't have to explain how you know, just free verse if it doesn't have a rhyme scheme. You may recall from a bit ago when we first talked about types of poems, free verse is meant to sound and read more like how people actually talk. That's one of the goals of it. So if it's free verse, what do I put for rhyme scheme? I would write NA, not applicable. So if it's free verse here, there's not going to be a rhyme scheme here. Pause so you can write that. Try and remember to do that. Okay, for imagery, it says, use a text citation to select an example of imagery in the poem. I already worked ahead and did this for us, and you're more than welcome to take my answer or your own. So you're going to write it in a text citation. Like I said, you can use this one. So one piece of imagery that stuck out to me was the last line. I could really picture it. Singing with open mouths, their strong melodious songs. So I have Whitman, line 11, the very end. And then here, I need to write, well, how or why did I choose this imagery? What about it captured my attention? I could write, I chose this because I could really picture it, people just really singing happily at the end of the day. I'm going to pause so you can find or write either the imagery I have or your own, and then write the answer of how or why it captured your imagination or why you picked it. Take a moment to do that, and then we'll move on. Next, literary devices. So let me flip back to the poem here, if it'll let me. So one thing I'm looking for is a literary device. So this is where the author has messed with either sound or some other device to add a form or rhythm to the poem. In this case, yesterday we talked about cataloging. So cataloging is where you make lists. And this entire poem is cataloging. So we have a list of all the professions here and then them singing. So what I could write, let's go back. So here for literary device, I would write cataloging. And I've added from our last poetry analysis, these are the two terms that come up a lot with Whitman. Tomorrow we'll be talking about parallelism. But for today, cataloging. For example, from the poem, since we saw the entire poem is cataloging, I can write that. Example from the poem, the entire, notice it doesn't say I have to have a text citation, I just had to have one up there. So I can paraphrase or I can use a text citation. So I'm gonna summarize, paraphrase. So I'm gonna say the entire poem is listing jobs or work. And then what's the effect of that? It's really up to you for what you put this, but I'm gonna put, it shows people around the nation happily working. I'm going to pause so you can write that, and then we will move on to figurative language. All right, let's go back to the poem and see if we can't find any figurative language. So that means a reread. Usually you end up reading a poem to analyze it 3 times or so. So I hear America singing the varied carols I hear. So a carol in this case, it could be literal or it could be a metaphor. It could be the sound of them working sounds like singing or a carol to him. So that's one of them. Those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off of work. Sometimes students will see this as and decide, oh, it's a simile, it has like or as. But here he's not really making a direct comparison, so it's not a simile. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck, the shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the plowboys. Get the idea. Let's go back and see, what does this look like then? What figurative language is that if we're using singing as a comparison for work? So I thought the clearest figurative language, and obviously you can take this answer, we're doing this together. I thought symbolism was the clearest because in this poem, it felt to me like singing equaled happily working. So that's how he's showing that. So example from the poem, the repeated mentions of different professionals singing. And then I'm going to add and described as doing the singing happily. Or I could, let's phrase this even better. Different professionals singing happily. There we go. Add the adverb at the end. So what's the effective meaning of this? I would argue the effect or meaning of this symbolism is singing as a symbol shows happiness. Typically. Typically, when we think of singing, it's a happy activity, unless, of course, context has changed. You're at a funeral or something. But especially in this poem, singing as a symbol shows happiness. So what does that mean? This shows Whitman finds work to be a good thing. I'll pause so you can get that. All right. So moving on, I believe this is it. Should be, it's theme. All right. So I took out personal response this time around because I felt you had enough to do. So theme, what do you think the author's message is? How do you know? So include evidence in the poem. So theme here, evidence to support. A lot of times, figurative language and theme are going to connect. And remember, the other way to find theme is the title. So I hear America singing. So he's putting himself in there, Whitman is. So I would say, since we have repeated imagery of people working happily, I would say the message is America is a place of happy workers, according to Whitman. What's my evidence? The poem describes various professions singing their work to show joy. So there you go. There's a Whitman poem. I'll pause so you can get this last theme bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about your next one. So tomorrow, as promised, we're going to read Song of Myself. I'll read the poem with you and get you started on these prompts, but you'll do more of these on your own. Luckily, it follows the exact same pattern that we took today with I Hear America Singing. So you folks have the rest of the time to either finish getting all the answers, finish putting in all the answers for this first part, or you can start reading the next poem. Or your third option is you can work on missing work, either for my class or for other classes. Whatever you choose to do it well. Go for it.